All right, so we are starting the nervous system unit, and we're going to be covering actually 4 chapters in this unit in your textbook. So I'm doing the notes a little different in that I've given you lots of visuals, and I'll give you page numbers of where you can read about this visual. So if you're not understanding what's on the PowerPoint, you can go to the page reference to read about it. So we're in chapter 11 in this first part, looking at fundamentals of nervous tissue. We're going to quickly review the action potential, talk about gated channels, kind of refresh your memory from some of those concepts that you learned in general A&P. So we're starting in chapter 11, and our first slide looks at just basic functions of the nervous system. This is on page 387. So I don't expect you to quick whip open your book and follow along in the book right now. Just write the page reference down when I give it to you so you know where to look. So page 387 has this first slide looking at figure 11.1. So if we look at the basic function of the nervous system, it's to take information from outside the body, work with it, and decide what kind of response do we need, or do we need to respond to this input that we're getting from outside the body. So the input that's coming in happens through neurons, and you learned the basic anatomy of a neuron back in general A&P, and we'll review that again also. But this is the sensory pathway. It's the sensory neurons that bring information from the outside of the body to the inside to decide if we need to deal with that information. So in this sense, in this picture, we have an eye looking at a glass of water. So that information is stimulating sensory receptors here. So these would be sensory receptors. So you should label that diagram as sensory receptors, bringing it along the sensory neuron into the central nervous system. So this green neuron here is part of the central nervous system. And what 2 parts make up the central nervous system? Do you remember from general A&P? Yeah, the brain and spinal cord. So the green arrow represents not only the brain but the spinal cord. So that's information coming into the central nervous system. And the brain is kind of the boss, that it's going to determine what information is necessary to be passed outward in a response to this information, unless it's a reflex, right? The reflex doesn't necessarily involve the brain, it just involves the spinal cord. So the next neuron we see in the series is the motor response. It's the output from the central nervous system on how are we going to respond to the information that's coming in. So this is the response. We call this the motor neuron. And notice that its axon terminals are synapsing on some effector organ, and in this case it's a skeletal muscle, the biceps, which is going to contract along with muscles in the arm and the lower arm and the hand to pick up that glass of water. So the information coming in via the sensory pathway to the brain is interpreted, and the brain says, I'm thirsty. So as a result, it sends a signal out the motor neuron to pick up that glass of water. So be able to identify the pathways. So this is the sensory pathway. Another name for that is the afferent pathway. So AFFERENT, sensory or afferent. And this is the motor or efferent pathway. It's the response. So EFFERENT, motor or efferent pathway. This diagram kind of summarizes all the functions of the nervous system, and this is on page 388 of your textbook. So looking at this first box here, this is referring to the brain and spinal cord. So this is what we call the central nervous system. Notice that we have arrows, the same color that we saw in the previous slide. So the blue arrow represents the sensory information coming into the central nervous system, and the red arrow represents the motor response leaving the central nervous system. So we have structures that extend from the brain and spinal cord that are bringing information to and from the outside. So what is that? What are those structures? Nerves, not neurons. Neurons are single cells, but nerves are bundles of axons. So this is called, right here, the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, which is made up of nerves. So we have nerves that are coming to the central nervous system, and we have nerves that are coming from the central nervous system back to an effector organ as a response. So we talked about in lab that we have how many pairs of spinal nerves? 31 pairs, right, good. So they are bringing information back and forth, so we call them mixed nerves, right, because they can go both directions. So the blue and red arrow represents a mixed nerve if we have the same highway carrying information in two different directions. And then we talked about the nerves coming off the brain, which we call what? Cranial nerves. How many pairs do we have? 12 pairs. So those are, I wish this wouldn't keep popping up. That's what I wanted. Okay. So those are, some are purely sensory, some are purely motor, right? So some of the nerves coming off the brain have only one direction of information. They're only sensory or only motor. And then there were 4 that we talked about in lab that were mixed, that had some sensory information it was bringing in and also had some motor response going out. But anyway, so the 2 major divisions of the nervous system are the central nervous system, which are the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which are the nerves, either coming off the brain or the spinal cord. So if we look at information with the peripheral nervous system, we have information here that comes into the, what's the word I'm looking for? Information that comes from the nerves via the sensory pathway. So this would be just the sensory division. So, and the sensory division is made up of sensory receptors. So here you would just label this as sensory, and what specific structures make up the sensory pathway? Sensory receptors. And there's a couple of different types of sensory receptors, and I'm going to just quick go over to a Word document here and list some of those for you. So some common sensory receptors, I'll make this bigger so you can see it. Pain receptors, I'm just going to write them. Nociceptors are pain receptors. So they bring information into the body signaling pain. Then we have temperature receptors that are thermoreceptors. And then we have receptors in our muscles and joints that give us indication of body position. We call those proprioceptors. So we find those in our muscles and joints, giving us a sensation of where we are in our space. If we're standing up, lying down, spinning in circles on a carnival ride. Another one are osmoreceptors. And those tell us the concentration of solutes in plasma, like hormones we talked about, ion concentrations, sugar concentrations. Those are osmoreceptors. And then we have something called mechanoreceptors, that if I push on your skin, that morphs the cell membrane and stimulates mechanoreceptors, which just can detect a change in the shape of the cell membrane. Then we have photoreceptors. And what are those detecting? Light. Yeah, detecting light. So these are some examples of some sensory receptors that you're going to talk about in this unit of the nervous system. And that's all things that are stimulated on, from some outside stimulus, and it's bringing that information to the spinal cord via the sensory pathway of a nerve. Okay, so going back, we have, again, the sensory division, which is made up of sensory receptors. And then we have the response. Remember, the red arrow is the response. So these nerves are going to carry information which are going out to effector organs. So this is the motor pathway, or the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. And the motor division can be 2 responses. We can respond to our environment in one of 2 major areas. We have the somatic response, and the word somatic means voluntary what? Do you remember from general? Voluntary, what parts of our body can we voluntarily control? Muscles, very good, muscle. Skeletal muscle. So the somatic nervous system is voluntary skeletal muscle. So that's what you would put in this box right here. somatic, S-O-M-A-T-I-C, somatic nervous system, which is voluntary skeletal muscle. And then on this box, this is the involuntary response from our body. For example, let's say you're running from a bear and you need to run away, which is the somatic response, contracting your muscles. But then we also need to get our smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands kicked into action, and that's the autonomic nervous response, motor response, and that's involuntary. And again, whenever you hear the word autonomic, I want you to automatically tell yourself cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So what are some examples of things that have smooth muscle in our body? GI tract. What else? So your stomach, small intestine, large intestine, uterus, blood vessels, airways, iris of the eye. Those are some good ones that you should know are made of smooth muscle. So if you can think of any response that is in, oh, how about bladder? Reproductive tract, urinary tract. Those are all smooth muscle, and that's all involuntary. So that's the autonomic response. So if you're running from a bear, smooth muscle contraction is going to slow down to the GI tract because we don't want to put all that blood and energy into digesting our hamburger for lunch. We want to send that blood to the muscles to run away. But how would we want to affect cardiac muscle if we're running away from a bear? Increase it. How about the respiratory rate? Increase it. How about the iris of the eye? Yeah, you want to dilate the iris of the eye so you can see better. So that would be the autonomic response happening at the same time as the somatic response. And if you look at the box for the autonomic response, you'll see that it's broken down into two boxes. So this autonomic response can go one of two ways. We can have the rest and digest division, which we call what? Yep, the parasympathetic. So this response here can go parasympathetic. Or it can go, and that's, like I said, you should label that on your diagram, rest and digest. And then the other response is the sympathetic. And what do we call that one? Fight or flight. So that's kind of a summary of the whole nervous system, and we're going to spend time in each box talking about the details. So when you talk about an advanced A&P, the forest versus seeing the forest through the trees, this is the forest. So always think about how everything is related. And then we're going to talk about the trees, which are going to be the details within each division. So before we do that, we should review the basic structure of a neuron. So a neuron and a nerve are not the same thing. Remember that neurons are bundles, nerves are bundles of axons. So we're just looking at this portion that's bundled up into a nerve. A neuron is just a cell of which there are millions and millions of cells that make up the nervous system, and they all communicate with each other through these special endings that they have. What do we call the receiving part of a neuron? The dendrites. So these are the dendrites. So they receive information coming in. So if we're looking at a sensory receptor, for example, these would be specialized dendrites that receive information coming into this neuron. So sensory receptors are going to be found on the dendrites of a neuron. But the sensory neurons don't look like this. They have a different appearance, and it shows pictures of sensory neurons in your textbook on page 394. It's actually, a lot of those are bipolar neurons. But the majority of the rest of the cells, neurons in the nervous system look like this. These are called multipolar neurons. So anyway, so this is the dendritic end, which receives information coming in, and then you have the cell body, which you can see there's a nucleus, there's mitochondria, I can see a little bit of rough ER here. So all the organelles you'd see in any typical cell are clustered into this cell body. And then it narrows here, and see this triangular portion here? This is a special region of the neuron that's important for initiating electrical impulses called action potentials. This is called the Axon Hillock. The Axon Hillock. So you should label that part so you know what it is. Hillock. And that is going to be important for getting an action potential started. And then the rest of this yellow part, so don't look at the blue part yet, just look at the yellow portion, that's the axon. So that's just a highway for carrying an electrical impulse to the end of the neuron. So this whole yellow thin part here is an axon. And then that axon ends with these tiny little axon terminals. So these are axon terminals. And if you remember when we studied the endocrine system, we talked about how the posterior pituitary is just an extension of the hypothalamus. So up here in the hypothalamus, we would find the cell body, which makes ADH and oxytocin. And then the axon from that neuron extends into the posterior pituitary, and the axon terminals are just down in the posterior pituitary, that when we need ADH and oxytocin, it's just released from these axon terminals at the end of the neuron that started in the hypothalamus. So when we talk about serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, important neurotransmitters, they're made up here in the cell body, but they're stored in the axon terminals when they're ready to be released for whatever nerve function they're going to perform. So the next cell would be right here. If it's another neuron, if we're carrying information, through a pathway from the outside up to the brain, we would see another neuron here. But if this is the motor neuron that's at the end of the response, it might be a skeletal muscle out here. Or if it's an autonomic neuron response, what would we see out here? Not a skeletal muscle cell. Smooth muscle cell, cardiac muscle cell, or some endocrine gland cell, right? Some endocrine cell. So this is the end of the road for this neuron, is down here, these axon terminals. So we're going to see lots of little vesicles containing a neurotransmitter waiting to be released. So if we look at the plasma membrane here, all this yellow is plasma membrane. So even though it looks quite different from a typical cell you saw in lab, this round structure, right, with the plasma membrane around the outside, it's still a cell. It just has a kind of a funny shape to it. But all the orange, yellowish color you see here is its plasma membrane. So it has the lipid bilayer, it has markers, carbohydrate markers on the surface, cholesterol embedded, just like we see in a typical cell. And then we'll also see these protein channels. But neurons have the ability to change the concentration of ions inside the cell compared to outside the cell, because they have special channels which are voltage-gated channels that open in response to a stimulus, and we're going to talk about that a lot. But this is an example of a chemically gated channel. Another name for a chemically gated channel is ligand gated, Ligand. So ligand gated, it just means the ligand is some chemical, some neurotransmitter that has to bind to the channel in order for it to open. So if you look at your example on the left, and this picture is on page 396 of your textbook. If we look here, here's the receptor on this channel that is waiting for some ligand, some chemical to bind to it to open it up. But if that chemical is not present, it's not going to open, and these ions, let's say this is sodium, cannot pass into the cell. But now if that ligand is present, so here the orange structure represents, say, maybe acetylcholine. If acetylcholine binds to this channel, then the channel opens and ions can pass through. What's unique here, which isn't really typical, is that we see two different types of ions passing through the same channel. Typically we don't see that. Typically, one ion has its own channel, and it can only pass through that channel. So sodium channels only allow sodium through, and potassium channels only allow potassium through. But this would be a chemically gated or ligand gated channel because it requires some binding of a molecule in order for it to open. And we find these kinds of channels on the dendrites or the cell body of a neuron. So you should write that down here. This is where chemically gated channels are found on the cell body or dendrites of a neuron. This type of channel on the next page is called a voltage-gated channel. And it only opens or closes when there's some change in charge across the membrane. Typically, our cells are more negative on the inside compared to the outside, and we'll talk about why that is when we come back for lecture on Thursday. Or what day is today? Thursday. Next time. I want to say next time. Anyway, so this is negatively charged, this is positively charged, so it is closed when this particular voltage exists. Then, if we change the voltage by changing the flow of ions or applying electricity, specifically, giving an electrical input into the cell, we see that channel will open, as long as it's more positive inside compared to the outside. And different ions have their own specific channels, which have their own specific voltage in which they open up. So we'll talk about that later on also. But just so you understand, these are voltage-gated channels that only respond to some change in charge across the membrane. Otherwise, they're closed. So again, if we look at the neuron, we find, like I said, the chemically gated channels, the ligand-gated channels are going to be here. And we find that voltage-gated channels start at the axon hillock, and we find them throughout the axon. And we even find some on the axon terminals. So we'll find voltage-gated channels here, from the axon hillock all the way through the axon terminals, and chemically gated on the dendrites and cell body. So we're going to pick up on next time looking at the resting membrane potential and what causes these channels to open. Some of them stay open all the time, some are regulated.